My husband's best friend told me I was only his backup plan and claimed he proposed to her first. Then I discovered she had been obsessed with him for years and stalked our marriage until we finally took her to court. My husband's best friend, Lily, pulled me aside at our anniversary party and destroyed my entire marriage with one conversation. She'd been drinking champagne all night, getting louder and touchier with my husband, Jar. I'd watch them laugh at inside jokes for 3 hours while I played hostess to 40 guests celebrating our 7th wedding anniversary. When I finally got a moment alone in the kitchen, she followed me, leaning against the counter with this strange smile. "You know, you're just the consolation prize, right?" she said, swirling her glass. I asked what she meant. She laughed, not mean exactly, but pitying. Jamar proposed to me first 8 years ago. We were together all through college and 2 years after. He had this whole elaborate plan at the botanical gardens with my favorite flowers everywhere. I said no because I was already engaged to Bradley. Jar didn't know about Bradley. We'd been long distance, and I never mentioned him because I loved having Jar as my backup plan. She took another sip. He was absolutely destroyed, cried for weeks. Then 3 months later, he met you at that conference and married you within a year. He needed someone, anyone, to prove he could be chosen. You were available and eager, that's all. I stood there holding a stack of dirty plates while she explained how she kept Jar close all these years because she enjoyed knowing he still wanted what he couldn't have. How she'd test him sometimes, little touches and comments, and watch his eyes follow her across rooms. Bradley and I divorced last year, she continued. Jar knows he's been weird ever since, probably wondering if he made the wrong choice. Then she patted my shoulder and walked back to the party. I spent the next 2 weeks watching everything differently. Jamar did stare at Lily when she visited. He did text her constantly, more than he texted me. He kept a box of her college photos in his office drawer. When I brought up maybe seeing less of Lily, he got defensive. Said I was being controlling and insecure. Said she was family to him and I needed to accept that. Fine. I started working late, stopped cooking his favorite meals, stopped asking about his day. He didn't notice for a month. When he finally asked if something was wrong, I said no, just busy with the new project at work. He seemed relieved not to discuss it further. 2 months passed like this. Then Lily started showing up more often. Sunday dinners, random Tuesday movie nights, she'd sit between us on the couch. She'd cook in our kitchen wearing tiny shorts and Jar's old college sweatshirt. I said nothing. 3 months after the anniversary party, I came home early from a canceled meeting. Jar's car was in the driveway next to Lily's. I walked in quietly. They were in the living room, not touching, but sitting close on the floor, going through photo albums, college photos. "Remember this?" Lily kept saying. "Remember that night? Remember when we thought we'd be together forever?" Jar was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, young, alive. Then Lily said, "I made a mistake choosing Bradley." "We both know that now." Jar didn't disagree. He just kept looking at the photos. That's when I walked in. They jumped apart like teenagers. I said I forgot some files and went to the office. 20 minutes later, Jamar knocked. "That wasn't what it looked like," he said. "We were just reminiscing." I nodded and kept working. "Lily's been going through a hard time since the divorce," he continued. "She needs friends right now." I said, "Okay," and turned back to my computer. He stood there for another minute, then left. The next morning, I called Lily's ex-husband, Bradley, found him on LinkedIn, sent a message saying I needed to discuss something important about Lily and Jar. He called me within an hour. Turns out, Lily didn't choose Bradley over Jar all those years ago. The truth was, Jar had never proposed to Lily. They dated for maybe 6 months in college. Nothing serious. Jamar broke up with her when he met someone else. Lily had been obsessed with Jar, showed up at his apartment crying multiple times, threatened to hurt herself if he didn't take her back. Campus security got involved. After graduation, Jar moved cities partly to get away from her. Bradley divorced Lily because she'd been stalking Jar online for years, had a folder of photos of Jar and me from social media, had been planning to break up our marriage since she found out we were engaged. "She's sick," Bradley said. I tried to get her help, but she refused. "Be careful." I sat in my car after Bradley's call ended, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Everything Lily said at the anniversary party was a lie. But the truth Bradley just told me was somehow worse because it meant Jar had been either blind or complicit for years. I couldn't go home yet. I couldn't face Jar with this information burning in my chest. Knowing he'd kept a stalker in our lives for 7 years, I started the car and drove to my sister Natalie's house across town. My mind, replaying Bradley's words about the folder of photos, the journal, the threats. Natalie opened the door before I even knocked, took one look at my face and pulled me inside. I told her everything Bradley said about Lily's stalking, the threats to hurt herself, the obsession that drove him to divorce her, the fact that campus security got involved back in college. Natalie's face went from concern to angry as I talked, and she called for her husband Dylan to come downstairs. Dylan worked in private investigation, and he sat down with us at the kitchen table while I repeated the whole story. He listened carefully, taking notes, asking specific questions about dates and incidents. He explained how stalkers operate, how they build elaborate fantasies, and can't separate those fantasies from reality. He said the fact that Lily had kept this up for 8 years meant she was deeply committed to her delusion and wouldn't stop without serious intervention or legal consequences. Dylan pulled out his laptop and helped me create a detailed timeline of every interaction between Jar and Lily over our 7 years of marriage. We started with when we got engaged and Lily suddenly reappeared in Jar's life after years of no contact. Looking at it all written out, I saw patterns I dismissed as friendship but now recognized as Lily systematically maintaining access to my husband. The Sunday dinners that became weekly. The texts that came at specific times every day. The way she always wore Jar's old clothes when she visited. The photos she posted on social media that always included Jar or our house. Dylan pointed out how she'd inserted herself into every major event in our marriage, always positioning herself as the most important person in Jar's life besides me. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight. I finally drove home and found Jomar waiting up in the living room, his phone in his hand. He looked worried and asked where I'd been because I hadn't answered his texts. I sat down across from him and said I'd spoken with Bradley. I asked him directly if he knew Lily had stalked him in college, and his face went pale in a way that told me he knew something. Jamar was quiet for a long moment before admitting that Lily went through a rough patch after he broke up with her in college. He said she showed up at his apartment a few times, but he claimed he thought she'd gotten help and moved on. When I pointed out she'd been in our lives constantly for 7 years, he got defensive. He said I was overreacting, that Bradley was probably lying because he was bitter about the divorce, that Lily was just a good friend who cared about him. I pulled out the timeline Dylan had helped me create and spread it across the coffee table. I pointed out every time Lily showed up unannounced, every time she wore his old college clothes, every time she positioned herself physically between us on the couch or at parties. Jamar stared at the paper for a long time, his finger tracing the dates and incidents. Finally, he said he needed to think about this, which wasn't the immediate horror and protection I needed from him. I wanted him to be angry, to call Lily right then and tell her to stay away, to apologize for letting this happen. Instead, he just sat there looking at the timeline like it was a puzzle he couldn't solve. I went to bed alone while he stayed on the couch. The next morning, I called Bradley back before Jar woke up. I asked if he still had any of the evidence from Lily's stalking that led to their divorce. Bradley said he kept everything because his lawyer told him to, and he was willing to share it with me if it would help protect me and Jar from her. He said he'd email it over within the hour. I sat at my laptop refreshing my inbox until Bradley's email came through. The folder contained screenshots of Lily's social media obsession with Jar, going back years before Bradley even knew about it. Photos she'd collected of him from mutual friends' accounts saved and organized by date. A journal she'd kept documenting Jar's daily routines. What time he left for work, what coffee shop he went to, what gym he used. Reading her entries made my skin crawl because she wrote about him like they were in a relationship, even while she was married to Bradley. She described imaginary conversations they'd have, plans for their future together, how she was just waiting for the right time to make Jar see they belonged together. That evening, I showed the evidence to Jamar. I watched his face carefully as he read through Lily's journal entries about him. He looked sick, his hand shaking slightly as he scrolled through page after page of her obsessive documentation. But then he tried to minimize it by saying she was probably just venting harmlessly in a private journal, that lots of people write things they don't mean. I stared at him in disbelief and asked if he seriously thought a married woman keeping a journal about his daily schedule and writing about their imaginary future together was harmless venting. I closed the laptop and looked at Jar sitting there on the couch. I told him he needed to cut off all contact with Lily right now immediately. No more texts or calls or visits. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. He shifted in his seat. He said he couldn't just ghost someone who'd been his friend for so long. He said it would be cruel to cut her off without explanation when she was going through a hard time with the divorce. I felt my stomach drop listening to him defend her, even after reading her journal entries about tracking his daily schedule. I asked him if he understood that his friend was actually a stalker who'd been planning to break up our marriage for years. He got defensive and said I was overreacting, that Bradley probably exaggerated everything because he was bitter, that Lily just needed better boundaries, not total abandonment. I stood up and told him his priority right now should be protecting his wife, not worrying about hurting his stalker's feelings. He said I was being controlling and jealous, just like he'd worried about. That's when I really lost it. I pointed at the laptop and asked if he'd actually read the part where she wrote about waiting for the right moment to make him see they belonged together. He said she wrote that stuff while married to someone else, so obviously she didn't really mean it. I stared at him, trying to understand how he could be this blind or this willfully ignorant. We fought for 2 hours going in circles with him, making excuses and me pointing out facts he couldn't deny, but somehow still managed to minimize. He kept saying Lily was harmless, just confused, just going through something difficult. I kept saying she was dangerous and obsessed, and had been manipulating both of us for 7 years. Finally, around midnight, he said he needed space to think, and he'd sleep in the guest room. I watched him grab a pillow and walk down the hall. I lay in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my marriage had ever been real or if I'd just been a placeholder in Lily's long game to get Jar back. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Jar left for work early without saying goodbye. I called my friend Caroline around 9 after I knew she'd be between clients. She's a therapist, but I wasn't calling for professional advice. I just needed someone to tell me if I was losing my mind. She listened while I explained everything from the anniversary party to Bradley's revelations to Jar's refusal to cut contact. When I finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said my instincts were absolutely right. She said Jar's defensiveness was a huge red flag because he was prioritizing his stalker's feelings over my safety and our marriage. She said I needed to protect myself even if Jar wouldn't. I started crying on the phone, relieved that someone validated what I was seeing. Caroline told me to document everything going forward. Every text from Lily, every conversation with Jar, every incident. She said I should also consult with a lawyer, not necessarily for divorce, but to understand my options if Jar kept choosing Lily's presence over my peace of mind. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly less crazy, but way more scared about what all this meant. Jamar came home that evening and we barely spoke. He made himself dinner while I worked on my laptop. We moved around each other like strangers. 2 days passed like this, cold and distant, sleeping in separate rooms. Then on Thursday morning, I got a text from Lily. She asked if everything was okay because Jar had been distant with her lately. I read that message 3 times. She'd noticed a 2-day change in Jar's behavior toward her. She was monitoring him closely enough to detect a slight shift in his texting patterns or response times. Everything Bradley had told me about her obsessive attention to Jar's patterns was right there in one text message. I took a screenshot immediately and added it to the folder Dylan had helped me create. When Jar got home that evening, I showed him Lily's text on my phone. I asked him if he thought it was normal for a friend to notice and comment on 2 days of slightly different behavior. He looked uncomfortable reading it. He admitted that Lily did seem to pay unusual attention to him, but then he added that she was probably just worried because they talked every day and the sudden change concerned her as a friend. I asked him what kind of friend monitors another person's communication patterns that closely. He said she was harmless and just needed better boundaries, like he'd been saying all along. I put my phone down and told him I was going to stay with Natalie for a few days. His face went pale. He asked me not to leave, said we could work this out, said he'd talk to Lily about boundaries. I told him his continued defense of her was choosing her over me, and until he understood that, I needed space to think about our marriage. I packed a bag while he followed me around the bedroom, trying to convince me to stay. I left anyway. Natalie's house felt safe in a way my own home didn't anymore. She made up the guest room and didn't push me to talk when I clearly wasn't ready. Dylan came home from work and found me sitting at their kitchen table, staring at nothing. He sat down across from me and offered to do a background check on Lily. He said his company had access to employment records and court filings, and he could see if there was any other documented concerning behavior. I agreed, even though it felt weird investigating my own life like this. But I needed to know the full truth about this woman who'd been circling my marriage for years. Dylan worked on his laptop for about an hour, while Natalie and I pretended to watch TV. When he called me over, his face was serious. He showed me what he'd found. Lily had been fired from a job 3 years ago. The termination paperwork cited inappropriate fixation and refusal to respect professional boundaries with a male coworker. There was no restraining order filed, but HR had documented multiple incidents of her showing up at his desk uninvited, texting him outside work hours, and making other employees uncomfortable with her attention toward him. Dylan printed everything out for me. I stared at the pages, seeing the same pattern Bradley had described, the same pattern I'd witnessed in my own marriage, now documented by a third party who had no reason to lie. I sent photos of the HR documentation to Jar that night with no message attached. He called me immediately. I didn't answer. He texted saying we needed to talk. I texted back that he could read the documents and we'd talk when he was ready to actually see what was right in front of him. He couldn't dismiss this as Bradley being vindictive or me being jealous. This was Lily's employer documenting her obsessive behavior toward another man 3 years ago, proving this was who she was, not just some past phase she'd grown out of. Jamar called me 20 minutes later. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. And he asked if we could meet to talk about everything. He said he'd been looking at the HR documents I sent, and he needed to explain some things he should have told me years ago. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop halfway between Natalie's house and ours, neutral territory, where neither of us had the advantage. I got there first and picked a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard. Jamar walked in looking like he hadn't slept, his shirt wrinkled and his hair uncombed. He sat down across from me and immediately started apologizing, saying he'd been thinking about Lily's behavior over the years, and he realized he'd been making excuses for things that weren't normal. He admitted he'd felt uncomfortable sometimes with how much attention she paid to him, how she'd show up places he mentioned going, how she remembered details about his life that even he forgot. But he'd convinced himself he was being arrogant to think she still had feelings for him after all these years, that he was imagining patterns that weren't really there. I asked him why he was finally seeing it now, and he pulled out his phone to show me Lily's texts. Since I'd left for Natalie's house 3 days ago, she'd sent him 17 messages, asking what she did wrong, and begging him to explain why he was pulling away from her. I scrolled through them and watched the tone shift from concerned friend to something desperate and possessive. The first few messages asked if he was okay and if our marriage was having problems. Then they got more intense, saying she could tell something was different in how he was acting toward her, and she deserved to know what changed. The most recent ones from this morning said she knew I was behind this and she wouldn't let me destroy their friendship. I handed his phone back and asked him if he thought that sounded like normal friend behavior. He stared at the screen for a long moment before admitting it looked really bad when you read them all together like this. Jamar started scrolling through the messages again with fresh eyes, and I could see him recognizing the obsession in Lily's words instead of dismissing them as concerned friendship. His phone buzzed with a new text while we were sitting there, and when he looked at it, his face went pale. Lily had sent another message saying she knew something was wrong and she deserved to know what was happening because they were too close for secrets. I watched Jar read it and asked him if he understood now that this wasn't normal, that friends don't monitor each other's communication patterns this closely, or demand explanations for slight changes in behavior. He nodded slowly and said he wanted to cut off contact with Lily completely, but then he added that he thought he should do it gradually to let her down easy, because he was worried about how she'd react to a sudden cutoff. I felt my anger spike at his suggestion, and told him that gradual was exactly the kind of thinking that had enabled Lily's obsession for 8 years. I explained that people like Lily don't understand hints or gentle letdowns. They interpret any continued contact as hope that things can go back to normal. I said the only way to deal with someone who can't respect boundaries is a clean break with no room for negotiation or future contact. Jamar looked uncomfortable, but said he didn't want to be cruel to someone who'd been his friend for so long, even if that friendship was built on her obsession. I pointed out that staying in contact with her was being cruel to me, his actual wife, and he needed to choose which relationship he wanted to protect. We spent another 20 minutes going back and forth before reaching a compromise. Jamar would send one clear message telling Lily their friendship needed to end, that he'd realized her feelings weren't platonic, and he needed to prioritize his marriage. He pulled up a new text and started typing while I watched over his shoulder. His first draft was full of apologetic language and explanations that left room for her to argue or negotiate. I made him delete the parts where he said he was sorry and he hoped she understood, the phrases that implied this was a mutual decision they could discuss. I told him to make it clear this wasn't up for debate, that the friendship was over effective immediately. He retyped the message 3 times before I approved it. And then he stared at his phone for another minute before finally hitting send. Lily's response came within 2 minutes. Jamar's phone lit up with a text that filled the entire screen, and I watched his face as he read her calling him a liar. She said I'd poisoned him against her, and she knew he didn't really want this. She threatened to tell everyone the truth about how Jomar had let her on for years while using me as a placeholder until she was available again. Jar looked shocked and started to respond, but another message came through before he could type anything. Then another. His phone kept buzzing with new texts, each one longer and more unhinged than the last. I took Jar's phone from his shaking hands and read through Lily's messages as they continued to pour in. She cycled through anger and pleading and threats in the span of 5 minutes. She said she had proof that Jar encouraged her feelings, that he'd told her he married me too quickly and regretted it, that he'd promised they'd be together once she left Bradley. She claimed she'd saved every text and email where Jar complained about our marriage and said he wished things had been different between them. She said she'd show everyone the evidence, and they'd all see that I was the villain keeping Jamar trapped in a loveless marriage. I looked up from the phone and asked Jamar directly if any of what Lily was claiming was true. He swore immediately that he never said those things, never encouraged her, never promised her anything. But I could see guilt on his face about something. And when I pressed him harder, he admitted he sometimes complained about our marriage to Lily when we were fighting. He said he'd vent to her about arguments we had or times when he felt like we weren't connecting, and he guessed she must have interpreted his complaints as him wanting out of our marriage. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized what he was describing. He'd been using Lily as an emotional affair partner, even if it never became physical. We spent the next hour sitting in that coffee shop going through every conversation Jar could remember having with Lily about our marriage. He told me about the time he complained to her after we fought about his parents visiting, and she'd said he deserved someone who appreciated his family. He mentioned venting about our sex life during a rough patch, and Lily had said some people just weren't compatible in that way. Every example he gave showed him sharing intimate details of our problems with someone who was actively hoping we'd fail, feeding information to someone invested in our breakup. I realized he'd been giving Lily ammunition to use against our marriage for years, showing her exactly where our weak points were, so she could position herself as the better option. Jamar broke down, crying right there in the coffee shop, his shoulders shaking as he said he never meant to betray me. He insisted he thought Lily was just a supportive friend who understood him, someone he could talk to when things got hard. I felt a weird mix of anger and pity watching him realize he'd been manipulated, but I also knew he'd chosen to confide in her instead of working on our marriage or seeing a real therapist. He'd picked the easy comfort of someone who told him what he wanted to hear over the hard work of actually fixing our problems. His phone kept buzzing with more messages from Lily, but neither of us looked at them anymore. We just sat there in silence while Jar cried, and I tried to figure out if our marriage was something I even wanted to save after learning he'd been emotionally cheating on me for years with a woman obsessed with destroying us. We left the coffee shop around 4 o'clock in the afternoon and drove home separately because I needed space from Jar, even though we were heading to the same place. His phone rang the entire drive home, and I watched in my rearview mirror as he kept declining the calls while gripping his steering wheel. When we pulled into our driveway, his phone had 17 missed calls from Lily, and the voicemails started playing automatically through his car speakers, loud enough that I heard them from my own car. Her voice got louder and more frantic with each message, saying she knew I was poisoning him against her and she wouldn't let me destroy their connection. She called him her soulmate, said I was keeping him prisoner in a loveless marriage, and that she'd fight for him no matter what I tried to do. The last voicemail was her crying and begging him to just talk to her for 5 minutes so she could explain everything. Jamar sat in his car, staring at his phone screen like he didn't recognize it, and I walked over and knocked on his window. He looked up at me with red eyes and unlocked the doors so I could slide into the passenger seat. I took his phone from his shaking hands and opened the recording app Dylan had helped me install earlier that week. Then I played back through all of Lily's voicemails while the app captured everything. Jar listened to her voice cycle through anger and pleading and threats, and I watched his face change as he finally heard how she really sounded when she wasn't performing the role of casual friend. She said things in those messages that no friend would ever say, claiming Jar had promised her they'd be together once she left Bradley, insisting she'd saved every text where he complained about me and wished things had been different between them. Jamar kept shaking his head and saying he never promised her anything, never encouraged her feelings, but I could see him recognizing the obsession that everyone else had been trying to show him for weeks now. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the text messages she'd sent during our coffee shop conversation, watching the pattern of her desperation play out in real time. I saved everything to the cloud like Dylan instructed, and forwarded copies to my own phone. building the case for harassment that we both knew was coming. Jamar looked sick as he read through message after message, where Lily swung between love-bombing him with memories of college and vicious attacks on me, calling me controlling and abusive and saying I'd manipulated him into cutting her off. That evening, around 7 o'clock, we were sitting in the living room trying to figure out our next steps when the doorbell rang 3 times in quick succession, followed by loud knocking. Jamar jumped up to answer it, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back down, looking through the window to see Lily pacing on our front porch. She rang the bell again and started knocking harder, calling out that she knew we were home because both our cars were in the driveway. Jamar stood frozen, watching her through the curtain while she pressed her face against the window, trying to see inside. And I pulled out my phone to call the police. Lily started yelling through the door that she deserved an explanation for why Jar was abandoning her after everything they'd been through together, saying she'd been there for him through his worst times, and he owed her at least a conversation. Her voice got louder as she pounded on the door, and I gave our address to the emergency operator, explaining that someone was refusing to leave our property after being told the friendship was over. Jamar kept staring at Lily through the window like he was watching a stranger. This woman he'd known for over a decade, transforming into someone he didn't recognize at all. The operator told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked until an officer arrived. And I could hear Lily's muffled shouting about how I'd brainwashed Jar and stolen him away from her. She kicked the door once, and Jar flinched, finally understanding that this wasn't just awkward or uncomfortable, but actually dangerous. The police officer arrived about 15 minutes later, and I watched through the window as he approached Lily on our porch. She immediately switched to a calmer tone, and I saw her gesturing toward our house while talking to him, probably explaining that she was Jar's best friend and just wanted to check on him. The officer listened for a few minutes, then knocked on our door and asked to speak with us, and Jar opened it while I stood behind him. The officer took our statement about ending the friendship and asking Lily to stop contact, and he wrote everything down in his notebook, including the voicemails and messages she'd sent. He turned back to Lily and told her she needed to leave our property immediately, explaining that she was trespassing, and if she returned, we could pursue charges against her. Lily's face changed from concerned friend to something harder, and she told the officer that she'd been Jar's best friend for over a decade, and she had a right to talk to him. She pointed at me and said I was controlling and abusive, that I was keeping Jar isolated from everyone who cared about him, and that the officer should be worried about Jar's safety, not hers. The officer remained professional and repeated that she needed to leave the property now. And Lily finally started walking toward her car, but not before turning back to shout that this wasn't over. She got in her car and sat there for another minute, staring at our house before driving away. And the officer waited until she was gone before talking to us again. He suggested we document everything and consider getting a restraining order if Lily continued trying to contact us, saying he'd seen situations like this escalate before. He explained that the fact she showed up at our home after being told to stop contact was a concerning sign that she might not respect boundaries, even with police involvement. After the officer left, Jamar and I sat in the living room in silence for a long time before either of us could talk about what just happened. We ended up staying awake until 3 o'clock in the morning, going over everything about our marriage, about how we got here, about whether we could actually fix this mess. Jamar apologized for not seeing Lily's obsession earlier, for confiding in her instead of me about our problems, for defending her all those times when I tried to raise concerns about her behavior. He cried again and kept saying he was sorry. But I told him I needed more than apologies, because sorry didn't undo years of him choosing to share our intimate problems with someone who wanted us to fail. We talked about every fight we'd had where he ran to Lily afterward, every rough patch in our marriage where she was the person he turned to instead of a real therapist or marriage counselor. Jar admitted he liked having someone who made him feel understood without challenging him to actually work on our issues. And hearing him say that out loud made me realize how deep his betrayal went. I asked him if he wanted to stay married to me or if he'd rather try to make things work with Lily now that she was available, and he looked shocked that I'd even ask. He swore he never wanted Lily romantically and never encouraged her obsession, but I pointed out that his actions told a different story, regardless of his intentions. I told Jar that if we were going to try to save our marriage, he needed to start therapy immediately, both individual sessions, to understand why he allowed this toxic dynamic, and couples counseling with me to rebuild the trust he'd destroyed. He agreed without hesitation, and I saw genuine remorse on his face, but I also knew that remorse wasn't the same as actual change. I explained that I needed to see consistent action over time, not just promises made in a moment of crisis when he was scared of losing me. We made a plan for him to find a therapist within the week and for us to start couples counseling as soon as possible. And I told him that if he missed appointments or didn't take it seriously, I was done trying. Jar nodded and reached for my hand, but I pulled away, telling him that physical comfort wasn't something he'd earned back yet. We finally went to bed in separate rooms around 3:30 in the morning, both of us exhausted, but knowing sleep wouldn't come easy after everything that happened. Over the next week, Lily continued trying to contact Jar through every method she could think of since he'd blocked her number. She sent emails to his work account and personal account, messaged him through social media platforms we'd forgotten he even had accounts on, and created new accounts when he blocked those too. Each message swung wildly between love-bombing him with happy memories from college and vicious attacks on me, calling me every name she could think of and blaming me for destroying their friendship. I screenshot everything and added it to our growing file of evidence, watching the pattern of her obsession play out in digital form. Jar looked more disturbed with each new message, finally seeing clearly what everyone else had been trying to tell him about Lily's unhealthy fixation. She sent him photos from college with captions about how happy they used to be, then followed up with messages saying, "I'd never understand him the way she did." One night, she sent 17 messages in 2 hours, each one more desperate than the last, begging him to remember their connection, and promising she could make him happier than I ever could. Dylan came over that weekend with a security consultant friend to help us install cameras around our house and change all the locks. He explained that stalkers often escalate when they lose access to their target, and the cameras would give us evidence if Lily tried to show up again. Jar looked embarrassed that we needed these precautions because of someone he'd called his best friend for years, but he helped with the installation without complaining. We put cameras at the front door, back door, and driveway, all connected to an app on both our phones so we could check them from anywhere. Dylan's friend also installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house and showed us how to set up alerts if anyone approached the property. The whole process took about 4 hours and cost more money than I wanted to spend, but I knew it was necessary to feel safe in our own home. Jamar kept apologizing while we worked, saying he never imagined his friendship with Lily would lead to us needing security cameras and new locks. I didn't respond because there wasn't anything to say that would make the situation less awful. The next morning, I woke up to texts from 3 different people asking if Jamar and I were okay because Lily had posted something weird on Facebook. I checked her profile and saw a long post about fake friends and people who stab you in the back after you give them everything. She didn't name us, but everyone who knew about their friendship would understand who she meant. Jamar got similar messages throughout the day from coworkers and mutual friends wanting to know what happened between him and Lily. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone, clearly stressed about how to respond to people. I could see him typing and deleting messages over and over, trying to figure out what to say that wouldn't make things worse, but also wouldn't let Lily paint herself as the victim. He finally asked me what I thought he should tell people, and I said he needed to be honest about why he ended the friendship. I explained that Lily was already controlling the story with her vague posts, and if he stayed silent, people would believe her version where she did nothing wrong, and we just turned on her for no reason. Jar looked uncomfortable with the idea of sharing private details, but I reminded him that Lily had a documented history of stalking and obsessive behavior that people needed to know about for their own safety. He agreed to talk to his closest friends and coworkers about the real situation instead of making up some polite excuse about growing apart. The next day at work, Jar sat down with his coworker Marshall during lunch and explained everything about Lily's stalking history from college, Bradley's divorce revelations, and her recent escalating behavior. Marshall listened carefully and then admitted something that made Jomar go quiet. He said he always thought Lily's attention toward Jar seemed too much, like she watched him constantly and got upset when he talked to other women at the office. Jamar asked what he meant, and Marshall described how Lily used to show up at their office building sometimes, supposedly to meet Jamar for coffee, but she'd arrive early and watch through the lobby windows. Marshall had seen her standing outside their floor multiple times, timing her arrival for when Jar usually took his break. He also mentioned that Lily would get this look on her face, angry and hurt whenever she saw Jar laughing with female coworkers or talking to the new women who joined their team. Marshall said he brought it up once years ago, suggesting that maybe Lily had feelings Jar should address, but Jar had brushed it off, saying Lily was just protective of him like a sister would be. Marshall hadn't pushed the issue because it wasn't really his business, and Jamar seemed happy to keep Lily around. Hearing this made Jamar realize how many signs he'd ignored or explained away over the years. He started thinking about all the times Lily found excuses to touch his arm or shoulder during conversations, how she'd lean in close when they talked, even in group settings. He remembered how she'd get quiet and moody during gatherings where I shared happy stories about our marriage, like she couldn't stand hearing about our good moments together. He also recalled her jokes about me not being good enough for him, comments she'd make when I wasn't around about how Jomar deserved someone who understood him better. At the time, he'd laughed them off as Lily being overly loyal to him. But now, he saw them as attempts to undermine our relationship and plant doubt in his mind about whether he'd made the right choice marrying me. Jamar came home that evening looking exhausted and told me about his conversation with Marshall and all the red flags he was finally seeing clearly. I felt vindicated, but also frustrated that it took this long and this much evidence for him to acknowledge what had been obvious to everyone else. We had our first appointment with Sienna Rowe 2 days later, a therapist who works with couples recovering from betrayal and broken trust. Her office was calm with comfortable chairs, and she started by asking us each to explain why we were there and what we hoped to accomplish through therapy. I went first and explained the whole situation with Lily, from the anniversary party confrontation, through Bradley's revelations about her stalking, to the recent escalation after Jar tried to end contact. Sienna listened without interrupting and then asked Jamar to share his perspective on what happened. Jamar talked about how he'd maintained the friendship with Lily for years without realizing her feelings weren't normal or healthy, how he dismissed concerns from me and others because he trusted Lily and believed their friendship was genuine. Sienna asked him some tough questions about why he kept confiding in Lily about our marriage problems, instead of working through them with me or seeking professional help. She also asked about the emotional needs Lily was meeting that I apparently wasn't, which made Jamar uncomfortable, but he tried to answer honestly. He admitted that Lily made him feel important and admired in ways that felt good, especially during times when our marriage was struggling, and he felt like he was failing as a husband. Hearing him say this out loud hurt more than I expected, because it confirmed that he'd been having an emotional affair with someone obsessed with him, even if he claimed not to realize her true intentions. Sienna helped me put words to feelings I'd been struggling to express, explaining that I felt like I'd been in a competition I didn't know existed for my own husband's attention and affection. She asked me to tell Jar directly how it felt, knowing that Lily was always there in his mind as an option or backup plan, even if he didn't consciously think of her that way. I looked at Jar and told him that every time he defended Lily or made excuses for her behavior, it felt like he was choosing her over me and our marriage. I explained that watching him light up around her in ways he didn't around me anymore made me question whether he actually wanted to be married to me or if he was just staying because leaving would be too complicated. Jamar's face showed real pain hearing this, and I could see him understanding for the first time how deeply his actions and choices had damaged our relationship and my ability to trust him. Sienna, let us sit with that heavy moment before gently guiding us toward discussing what steps we each needed to take to start rebuilding trust and connection. 2 weeks after Jomar sent Lily the message ending their friendship, I received an email from her directly. The subject line said we needed to talk, and the message was long, several paragraphs claiming she had proof that Jar had pursued her romantically throughout our entire marriage. She wrote that Jar had told her multiple times that he married me too quickly and regretted his choice, that he'd said I didn't understand him the way she did, that he'd promised they'd be together once she was free from Bradley. Attached to the email were screenshots of text conversations between her and Jar, and at first glance, they seemed to support her claims. I felt sick reading through them, seeing messages where Jar appeared to be flirting with Lily and complaining about me, but something felt off about the screenshots. So, I called Dylan and asked him to come look at them with his investigation experience. Dylan arrived within an hour, and I showed him the email and attachments on my laptop. He spent about 30 minutes examining the screenshots carefully, zooming in on different parts, and comparing timestamps. Then, he started pointing out inconsistencies that proved Lily had manipulated the images. He showed me how she deleted her own messages from the conversations, leaving only Jomar's responses, which looked bad without context. She'd also rearranged the timeline, taking messages from different conversations months apart, and putting them together to create a false narrative. Dylan explained that she'd used editing software to make it look seamless, but if you looked closely at the metadata and formatting, you could see where she'd cut and pasted. He pulled up the original conversations on Jar's phone to compare, and we could see that Jar's actual messages were innocent responses to things Lily had said first. But without her parts of the conversation, they looked like he was initiating romantic contact. The level of planning and technical skill Lily put into creating these fake screenshots scared me because it showed how far she was willing to go to support her delusion that Jar wanted her. Dylan said this kind of evidence manipulation was common with stalkers who need to justify their obsession by convincing themselves and others that their feelings are reciprocated. I saved everything Dylan showed me about the manipulation and added it to our growing file of evidence against Lily. The next day, I contacted Brady Moss, an attorney who handles stalking and harassment cases. Brady's office was downtown, and he had me bring all our documentation, everything from Bradley's original revelations through the recent emails and Lily's violation attempts. He spent over an hour reviewing the timeline we'd created, the screenshots of Lily's messages, the police report from when she showed up at our house, and the evidence of her manipulated conversations. When he finished reading everything, he looked up and said, "We had a strong case for a restraining order based on Lily's established pattern of obsessive behavior going back years." He explained that the fact she'd escalated after being clearly told to stop contact, that she'd shown up at our home despite warnings, and that she was now creating false evidence showed she posed a real threat to our safety and well-being. Brady said he could file for a temporary restraining order immediately, and we'd have a court hearing within a few weeks to make it permanent. He warned us that Lily would likely get worse before she got better, because stalkers often react badly to legal consequences, seeing them as further proof that their target is being controlled or manipulated by others. I signed the paperwork authorizing Brady to move forward with the restraining order and left his office feeling both relieved that we were taking legal action and anxious about how Lily would respond when she got served. Brady filed the paperwork for a temporary restraining order the next morning and called me that afternoon to say Lily had been served at her apartment. The process server reported she tried to refuse the papers at first, claiming they had the wrong person, but eventually took them after he explained he'd just keep coming back. The court date for the permanent restraining order was set for 3 weeks out, which felt like forever when I thought about Lily having that much time to react. Brady warned me on that call that stalkers often get worse when faced with legal consequences because they see restraining orders as proof their target is being controlled or manipulated by others. He told me to document everything, save every message or call, and contact police immediately if Lily showed up anywhere near us. I felt sick thinking about 3 more weeks of waiting and wondering what Lily would do next. Jamar and I spent that evening going over safety protocols Dylan had helped us establish, making sure our security cameras were working and our doors stayed locked. 2 days later, Jar got a message on social media from an account he didn't recognize with a profile picture of a random landscape photo. The message said Lily just wanted to explain her side before the court hearing, that she deserved a chance to tell her story, that Jar owed her at least that much after all their years of friendship. Jar showed me immediately, and we both recognized Lily's writing style in the desperate tone and the way she phrased things. She'd created a fake account to get around the temporary restraining order that specifically said no contact, direct or indirect. I took screenshots of everything while Jar blocked the account, and then I called Brady to report the violation. Brady sounded almost pleased when I told him what happened, explaining that violations this quick after a restraining order is issued actually strengthen our case significantly. He said judges take restraining order violations very seriously, especially when they happen within days of the order being served, because it demonstrates the person is unlikely to comply without serious legal consequences. Brady filed the violation documentation with the court that same day, adding it to our growing case file against Lily. The violation gave me a weird mix of relief and fear because it proved we needed the restraining order, but also showed Lily wasn't going to respect boundaries even when legally ordered. That weekend, Jamar's parents called after hearing about the restraining order through mutual friends who'd seen Lily posting vague things on social media about betrayal and legal abuse. His mom sounded confused and worried, saying they'd always thought Lily was such a nice girl and a good friend to Jar. I could hear Jar's voice get shaky as he explained the whole situation to them on speakerphone, telling them about Lily's stalking history from college, her obsession that Bradley documented during their divorce, her recent escalation after Jar tried to end the friendship. He finally said clearly what he'd been avoiding for weeks, that Lily was never really his friend, but someone obsessed with him who manipulated her way into our lives, and his parents had unknowingly helped her maintain that access. His mom went quiet for a long minute after Jar finished explaining everything. Then she apologized for encouraging Jamar to keep Lily close over the years, for inviting her to family events, for telling Jamar he was lucky to have such a devoted friend. She said she'd noticed Lily seemed a bit clingy and possessive, but she thought it was harmless, just Lily being affectionate with someone she'd known so long. Jamar's dad added that he felt guilty for not seeing the signs and for making Jar feel like cutting off Lily would be cruel or ungrateful. They promised to support us completely through the court process and to stop any contact with Lily if she tried reaching out to them. The 3 weeks until the court hearing crawled by with no further contact from Lily, which somehow felt more ominous than her previous constant presence. The morning of the hearing, I put on a conservative dress and Jar wore a suit, both of us trying to look as credible and stable as possible. Brady met us outside the courtroom and reviewed what would happen, who might testify, what questions the judge might ask. Then we walked in and I saw Lily sitting at a table with her own lawyer, wearing a soft pink sweater and looking small and sad like she was the victim in all this. Her lawyer was a woman in her 50s who kept patting Lily's hand and shooting angry looks at Jar and me. When the hearing started, Lily's lawyer tried to paint her as a heartbroken friend who'd been abandoned without explanation by someone she cared about deeply. She claimed Jar had led Lily on for years with inappropriate attention and intimate conversations, making Lily believe they had a special connection beyond friendship. Then, her lawyer said I was an abusive and controlling spouse who was isolating Jar from his support system and manipulating him against people who genuinely cared about him. I felt my face get hot listening to these lies, but Brady had prepared me for this strategy. Brady presented our evidence methodically, starting with Bradley's testimony about Lily's behavior during their marriage. Bradley walked to the witness stand, looking nervous but determined, and he brought a thick folder of documentation from their divorce proceedings. He described finding Lily's folder of Jar photos, hundreds of images saved from social media going back years. He explained about the journal where Lily tracked Jar's movements and routines, writing entries like they were in a relationship even while she was married to Bradley. The judge listened carefully, asking Bradley specific questions about dates and details, and I watched Lily's lawyer realize their victim narrative was falling apart. Bradley's voice stayed steady, as he explained that Lily's obsession with Jar was the primary reason he filed for divorce, that he tried to get her help, but she refused to acknowledge her behavior was problematic. When Brady showed the judge Lily's recent messages and the fake social media account she'd created to violate the temporary restraining order, I saw the judge's expression harden. He looked at Lily and asked her directly why she'd contacted Jomar after being legally ordered not to, and she started crying, saying she just wanted closure and didn't think one message counted as real contact. The judge granted a 3-year restraining order without much deliberation. After that, he told Lily that her behavior showed a clear pattern of obsessive fixation that required serious intervention and consequences. He ordered her to stay at least 500 feet away from both of us, from our home and from Jar's workplace, with absolutely no contact, direct or indirect, through any means. Lily started crying harder, telling the judge he didn't understand that she and Jar had a special connection that went back years, that I'd manipulated everyone against her by lying about her intentions. The judge's face got stern, and he warned Lily that any violation of this order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges, that her behavior in court was only confirming his decision to grant the restraining order. Lily's lawyer had to physically guide her out of the courtroom while she kept looking back at Jar with tears streaming down her face. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I felt relieved that we finally had legal protection, but not victorious, because I knew a piece of paper wouldn't magically fix Lily's obsession with my husband. Jamar held my hand tight as we walked to the parking lot, and he said he was sorry for all of it, for not seeing the truth about Lily sooner, for putting me through months of fear and doubt, for letting someone dangerous stay in our lives so long. I believed he meant the apology, even though sorry didn't undo the damage or erase the months of manipulation we'd endured. The weeks that followed the courthouse hearing felt like learning to live in a different house, even though we never moved. Jamar called a security company the next day, and 2 technicians spent an afternoon installing cameras around our property. Front door, back door, driveway, all the angles where someone could approach without us knowing. I watched the feeds on my phone that first night, checking them every 20 minutes until Jar gently took my phone and reminded me that constant checking wouldn't make us safer, just more scared. We started going to therapy every Thursday evening with Sienna, sitting on her comfortable couch that somehow made hard conversations slightly easier to have. Jamar began telling me everything without me having to ask, texting me when he left work, calling if he'd be 10 minutes late, showing me his phone when it buzzed, even though I didn't request it. Some days, his transparency felt suffocating because it reminded me why we needed it in the first place. But other days, I appreciated seeing him actually try to rebuild what he'd broken. Natalie called me every few days just to check in, sometimes talking about normal sister stuff and sometimes letting me vent about how angry I still felt, even though Jar was doing everything right now. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that some days I'd feel okay and other days I'd want to scream, and both reactions were valid after what I'd been through. Caroline met me for coffee twice a week, listening to me process the weird mix of loving Jar while also being furious at him for not protecting our marriage sooner. She never told me what to do, just sat with me in the mess of it all, which helped more than advice would have. During one therapy session, Sienna asked us to practice a communication exercise where we had to express difficult feelings without getting defensive or shutting down. Jamar went first, admitting he felt pressure to be perfect in our marriage, like any mistake or bad mood would prove he wasn't good enough. So, Lily's constant admiration felt easier than facing his own insecurities with me. I listened without interrupting, like Sienna instructed, even though part of me wanted to point out that his discomfort didn't excuse confiding in someone obsessed with him. When my turn came, I told Jar that I sometimes shut down during fights instead of working through them because conflict scared me, and that distance I created gave Lily space to insert herself as his emotional support. Sienna nodded and said this honesty was necessary, even though it hurt that we both contributed to the cracks Lily exploited, which didn't make Lily's behavior okay, but helped us understand how to build something stronger. The work felt exhausting sitting in that office every week, picking apart our marriage and our individual issues, but slowly I started seeing small changes in how we talk to each other at home. 3 months after the restraining order, Jamar's friend Diego called him sounding uncomfortable, saying Lily had reached out asking Diego to pass along a message. Diego told Jar he'd refused and actually decided to cut ties with Lily completely after Jar explained the full situation about her stalking and obsession. Jamar immediately called Brady to report the attempted contact, and Brady documented it as another violation of the restraining order's terms about indirect contact through third parties. The police contacted Lily with a warning that any further attempts would result in her arrest. And Brady said, this violation actually helped our case by showing she couldn't follow court orders, even with legal consequences hanging over her. Dylan's security consultant friend reminded us to stay alert because stalkers with obsessive patterns rarely give up completely. They just get quieter and wait for perceived opportunities. Our 8th anniversary arrived on a random Tuesday, and instead of throwing a party like last year, Jar and I stayed home and ordered takeout from our favorite restaurant. We sat on the couch eating pasta and talking about how different this year felt from last year's celebration, where Lily had pulled me aside and started this whole nightmare. Jamar handed me an envelope after dinner, and inside was a letter he'd written in therapy about his commitment to our marriage and his understanding of how badly he'd failed me by not seeing Lily's manipulation sooner. I cried reading his words about taking responsibility without making excuses, about recognizing that his actions hurt me regardless of his intentions, about promising to do better every single day, even when it was hard. We weren't back to where we were before all this happened. And honestly, we never would be, because that version of our marriage was built on false foundations where Jar had inappropriate boundaries, and I avoided difficult conversations. But we were building something new that felt more honest with actual communication instead of assumptions. And some days I genuinely believed we'd make it through this stronger than before. I started seeing my own therapist separately from our couples sessions, a woman named Dr. Beck, who specialized in trust issues and relationship trauma. She helped me understand that Jar's betrayal was real, even if it wasn't a physical affair. That emotional infidelity and poor boundaries caused legitimate damage. I was allowed to grieve. Dr. Beck said I didn't have to forgive quickly or pretend to be over it just because Jar was trying harder now. That healing happened on my timeline, not anyone else's schedule. One evening, Jar came home from work looking excited instead of his usual cautious, careful mood, and he told me his boss had offered him a promotion to senior manager. Instead of celebrating with coworkers first or waiting to tell me later, he came straight home to share the news with me, asking if we could go out to dinner to celebrate together. I felt myself smile genuinely for the first time in months, not because of the promotion itself, but because he'd immediately included me instead of compartmentalizing his work life like he used to do. Small moments like this showed me he was really trying to change his patterns, and I was learning to acknowledge his efforts even while I was still healing from everything that happened. 6 months after the restraining order became permanent, Jamar and I drove 3 hours north to a small cabin by a lake for the weekend. We needed space away from our house where Lily had sat on our couch and cooked in our kitchen and tried to take my husband. The cabin had 2 bedrooms and a porch overlooking the water, and we spent the first evening just sitting outside watching the sunset without talking much. The next morning, Jamar made coffee, and we sat at the wooden table discussing whether we should sell our house and buy something new in a different neighborhood. He said a fresh start might help us leave behind all the bad memories, and I agreed that coming home to the same living room where I'd found him looking at photos with Lily still made my chest tight sometimes. We looked at real estate listings on my phone and talked about what we wanted in our next place. Maybe something with a bigger yard and a proper office for each of us so we had our own spaces. That afternoon, We walked around the lake, and Jamar held my hand the whole time, and he told me he was proud of how strong I'd been through everything and sorry again for not protecting our marriage better. I told him I was learning to forgive him, even though some days were harder than others, and that I believed we could build something better than what we had before, because now we both understood what real boundaries looked like. I know Lily's obsession might come back someday because people like her don't just stop wanting what they've fixated on for years. I know Jar's emotional affair and his choosing to confide in her instead of me left damage that will take years to fully heal. But we're both in therapy every week, and we're both trying to be honest even when it's uncomfortable. And we're building a marriage where nobody else gets space to wedge themselves between us ever again. Some days I'm genuinely happy with him, and other days I still feel angry about everything he let happen. But I'm choosing to stay and do the work because I think we can
Make it.